Beyond being a massive wealth transfer to the well-off and well-credentialed, student debt cancellation is grossly unfair to every other American. Frankly, it's a slap in the face to the machinist, to the taxpayer, to anyone who didn't go to college, and to anyone who works for a living making financial sacrifices so they can pay their own or their kids' college bills that they saved instead of going on vacation or splurging on gadgets. Those people don't have student loans, but they've got other debt. Should the government cancel their mortgages, their car loans, their credit card bills? Of course not. It's almost never acceptable for the taxpayers to be forced to be responsible for someone else's voluntarily incurred private debt. Two similarly situated families with children who are in college. Let's say that they're about the same size, they've got about the same income, they have very limited assets in both cases. But one of the families spent 18 years of their children's lives scrimping and saving to pay for their kids' college education. The other family lived more comfortably. Maybe they took some more vacations, maybe they bought newer cars. The first family then writes a check, series of checks, to pay the tuition for their kids' college. And the second family has no college savings, so they take out a student loan. Tell me what you think about the fairness of saying to the family that worked hard and sacrificed, it's nice that you did that, but now your taxes are going to go to pay for the tuition of the family that chose to live more comfortably instead of saving for college. How is that fair?
Yeah, it's highly problematic to say to people who did their best to minimize the cost of higher education for themselves that you will now pay for people who didn't. And this is a problem in that people who take out student loans are not all necessarily low income or even middle income. We see that higher income families have taken out loans often to go to college.
We said, well, anybody who happened to graduate prior to, 2022 gets all their debt forgiven. How do you not forgive the debt of someone who graduates in 2024 or 2025? College tuition increased by 183%, 3 times the general elevation of the price level of the economy.
Yeah, so there's very strong evidence that the student aid programs have enabled price inflation in college. And if we say that we're going to cancel debt now, you have sort of automatically put in even more powerful incentives to borrow as much as you can and for colleges to raise prices as much as they can, because really a third party, taxpayers, will be the ones who pay for it. So we create a credential inflation problem. For those jobs where it's much more valuable to have on-the-job training, will now incentivize employers say, and also have a degree, because there are more degrees out there. It's a very basic screening.
It's a massive wealth transfer from taxpayers to a small subset of mostly wealthy individuals. Fewer than 1 in 5 American adults even have federal student loan debt. That means that 210 million American adults have no federal loan debt. So why do 80% of American adults have no student loan debt? Well, many of them never went to college. Or they went to college, but they didn't take out student loans. They just paid as they progressed. Or they took out student loans to pay for college, and they paid them back. Second, individuals with a bachelor's degree or higher overwhelmingly make more money than people who don't have those degrees. The vast majority of them are perfectly able to repay their loans. They have significantly lower unemployment rates, and on average, they earn $1 million more over their lifetime than non-college graduates. Third, student loan debt is primarily owed by wealthy families and graduate students. Even the Washington Post's left-leaning editorial board has blasted the president's plan as a transfer to the wealthy. They wrote, and I quote, "A broad cancellation would offer huge, undeserved benefits," end quote, to individuals in high-paying fields. And they correctly pointed out that, quote, "the vast number of American taxpayers lacking university degrees would subsidize well-heeled white-collar professionals," end quote. Now, all student debt is obviously voluntarily incurred. Over half of all student debt is taken by graduate students, many of whom happily incur the debt because they're entering high-paying fields like business and medicine and law. Of course, some graduate students have degrees that are not highly valued by the labor market. As the Wall Street Journal wrote, and I quote, "Doctorate recipients in the humanities in 2019 earned $53,000 on average. Machinists make more," end quote. But this begs the question, why should a machinist ever have to pay off the loans of an art history PhD, let alone a medical doctor? conclude by dispelling an argument that you may hear today that student debt cancellation will somehow ease inflation. The opposite is clearly true. Through May 1st of this year, the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, or CRFB, estimated that the COVID student loan repayment pause has already effectively canceled $5,500 per borrower on average, and thereby pumped roughly $5 billion of excess stimulus into the economy each month with no corresponding increase in the supply of goods and services. The CRFB estimates that full debt cancellation could raise inflation from the already outrageously high levels by between 1/3 and 1/2 an additional percentage point. So in addition to being egregiously unfair and bad policy, Americans simply can't afford it. Cancellation of student debt obscures the root cause of the problem here, and the root cause of this problem is the outrageously high cost of higher education. For decades, the government showered students with cheap debt and grants to go to college. With government paying so much of the cost, students were largely indifferent to the price. Understanding that price didn't matter to their customers, colleges responded by raising tuition. According to a study by the New York Fed economists, anytime there's an increase in the amount that a student can take out for a federal subsidized loan, 60% of that increase is passed through as a tuition hike. The solution is obvious here: less government subsidization and more personal responsibility. But it seems some have forgotten these immutable economic truths. Colleges have little incentive to keep prices reasonable if they believe government will cancel the debt used to pay for the tuition. They've already demonstrated that they are willing to raise prices at multiples of the rate of inflation because they can. If government starts canceling everyone's debt, then
The real danger, I think, to any sort of sweeping cancellation is, what does that say then in the future? The future then is, well, we should just expect that if we take out debt, it'll be forgiven, because how could you forgive debt in the past and not do it again? So we're making it even worse in incentivizing people to say, no, we really shouldn't economize as best we can because we'll expect these loans to be forgiven.
Doesn't the logic of the argument that we should wipe out this debt, doesn't it kind of require that it becomes a permanent thing? And I think Dr. Bishop even alluded to the idea that these should be grant programs. And if we said, well, anybody who happened to graduate prior to, 2022 gets all their debt forgiven, how do you not forgive the debt of someone who graduates in 2024 or 2025? So it is sort of embedded in the logic and inevitability that this is meant to be a permanent feature.
Sort of logically have to conclude that. I haven't actually seen something that said or a lot of discussion about eliminating student loan programs. I've just seen primarily a discussion of cancellation. And if you do cancellation without reform, at the very least, of existing programs, you're absolutely creating incentives for much more borrowing in the future with the assumption that it'll be forgiven.
Totally. That would be the expectation. From 1998 through 2018, which I think is the most recent year for which we have data, inflation increased by 56% in general during that period of time. College tuition increased by 183%, 3 times the general elevation of the price level of the economy. So how strong is the evidence that this massive excess inflation is related to increases in government contributions, and what would the effect on college tuition be if we did a broad cancellation?
Yeah, so there's very strong evidence that the student aid programs have enabled price inflation in college. We both actually cited the Fed report. That is just one among many studies that have found an inflationary effect of aid. If you look at sort of the historical sweep of prices, where you see a big increase, a big kink in how much we increase prices, was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when student loans were greatly expanded to who could access them. So the evidence is very clear, I think, that aid fuels price inflation. It enables it. And if we say that we're going to cancel debt now, you have sort of automatically put in even more powerful incentives to borrow as much as you can and for colleges to raise prices as much as they can, because really a third party, taxpayers, will be the ones who pay for it.
So just my last point. So the logical conclusion of this, as we've discussed, is just make it all free. Just give the money away. Just make it grants. Just make Like college free. In my state, there are quite a number of skilled blue-collar jobs that pay more than the average college graduate earns upon graduation. Welders and plumbers and people with all kinds of skills that are very valuable. But if you said, well, we'll just make the taxpayers pay for all of college, what kind of distortions would we get as a result of that policy?
Well, you'd see a lot more people who would be going to college and would see what we've seen now for several years, which is employers are increasingly requiring degrees for jobs that didn't previously require them, where there's not evidence that the skills needed to actually do that job have changed. So we create a credential inflation problem. For those jobs where it's much more valuable to have on-the-job training, will now incentivize employers say, and also have a degree, because there are more degrees out there. It's this very basic screening we could do to say, well, you may be able to give us an idea we could finish something you started if you have a degree. And it's just easier to ask for those things. But that credential inflation is incredibly inefficient, and it hurts people in the workforce